Good evening. Welcome to our Friday night Bible study for Friday, August 9th, 2024. And based on our unfortunate experience last week, I've decided that at some point we need to change the name. Well, we might still call it Friday night Bible study, but for those of you who are with us regularly, you may know that we had trouble getting the video uploaded to Facebook, to the Facebook group last week, and so I was posting notes on Facebook to say we have something, we're trying to upload it, we're running into trouble, and in the middle of all that, it got uploaded to YouTube. So I put a note on to say, look for the Friday Night Bible Study group on YouTube, and you can find it there. My wife suggested I needed to post the link. Well, then we tried to look for it, so she got on YouTube and searched for Friday Night Bible Study. Well, we were not searching for groups, we were searching for videos, and we got a very, very long list of videos with Friday Night Bible Study somewhere in the title or description. And it seems everybody and his brother does Friday Night Bible Study.
I never found you.
No. So when I edited the post to paste in a link, Facebook automatically put a window in for the video to play direct from YouTube on Facebook. I didn't know they would do that. I thought you'd have to click a link, but it's just there. You can click it and play it. Anyway, so we got it done that way. But that made us realize that the name Friday Night Bible Study is very much not unique. So. And most of you may know this, but we do pre-record this sometime Friday afternoon. Once we get it recorded, then we upload it to Facebook and schedule it for the post to appear at 6 o'clock. Now, when we were doing it live, the live program was supposed to begin at 6:30. So give you a half hour ahead if you know, for people who would try to watch it live. But of course it didn't get up until 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't think I finally found it, and in fact it got uploaded twice, and I had to delete one of the uploads, so it was there just once. And when that happened, well, then I deleted the post where I had the YouTube link as well. So, and of course that may mean that I need to. And the reason our videos weren't showing up was that I don't put Friday Night Bible Study in the title. It's the name of the group. So I thought it would be rather redundant to also put Friday Night Bible Study in the title. So that made it harder to find it. But anyway, so that's what happened last week. And other than that, we've had a good week. And life has progressed. And it's been hot. Where we live in August, it is hot. We actually moved here, well, let me calculate it out. 27 years ago this month. I think it was a little later in August when we got here, wasn't it?
I just remember it was really hot.
Yeah. We got here with a truckload of stuff, and we had to immediately rent a storage shed and unload from the truck into the storage shed. And my wife was bringing me Gatorade that I was drinking, just chugging it down because of how hot it was. And at that point, I wasn't nearly as used to the climate here as I am now. So it was a little tough because it was a lot of work, and it was being done inside the box of the truck, which kind of collected the heat. And it was August, so it was hot anyway. And Yeah.
And I had a UTI with a fever of over 100 out there working in that heat.
You had what?
I had a UTI with a fever of over 100.
Oh, yeah.
We got the truck unloaded and turned in, and then you took me to the ER.
Oh, I didn't remember that little bit, but yeah, I
Yeah,
can. You,
I had an argument with the doctor there.
yeah, I do remember that was a problem you had from time to time back in those days. So I'm not surprised. I just don't remember that specifically. Perhaps because I remember all the work and the heat, and you
Yeah,
bringing me
it,
the Gatorade. You actually had to go to the store and get the Gatorade, didn't you?
I might have, yeah.
Anyway, so
Dad was also there helping us unload,
yeah.
wasn't he?
Well, I think
No,
so.
he was working. He was there. It was just you and me. No, he was there. Why wasn't he at work?
Well, he hadn't started his job at the transit agency, so his only work was there in the garage with his rubber stamp business.
Okay.
So he could afford to take a little time off from that because his at that point already his business was lagging and failing, and he just wasn't getting anywhere as many orders. And part of the reason for that was simply because with the advance of technology, rubber stamps were just much less needed. So he wasn't getting near the orders. He kind of attributed it to not being in the big city. And that may have had something to do with it. But I think it was just, you
He
know,
didn't keep up with the times, the technology.
yeah, well, he needed to get an engraving machine, a computerized engraving machine. Would have cost him what, about 10 to 15 thousand.
I don't know.
He just didn't have the money for it, so he ended up taking a job with a transit agency and driving bus for kids and for old people that needed medical visits. And
Drove a Medicaid bus.
hmm,
He drove a Medicaid van.
yeah, he did that for almost 10 years, didn't he?
Or more, yeah.
He did it for quite a while. I know that.
Yeah.
And then when my sister and brother-in-law moved here, he had worked as a dispatcher for a trucking company, and he got a job with the same outfit, the same agency. He didn't last real long because his original employer wanted him back. They had an operation they were setting up in Georgia, and he went over there and did that because he was not getting along real well with the people at the agency, and I don't think he liked the work particularly. Anyway, so we're in kind of a difficult place given our view of God and our view of the Old Testament in our read through of the Old Testament, because we have reached the part where all the rules are spelled out. And the rules, as spelled out, are sometimes very contrary to what most people who aren't well versed in the Bible assume the Bible would insist on. For example, a lot of the rules, as we get to them, don't make any sense, because you would think that if there was a rule about monogamy, you wouldn't need all the other rules because the rule on monogamy would take care of it. But these rules are there telling us that monogamy was not ordered and demanded in this system of law. It was something that happened, and the laws allowed for it and said, here are the limits on what you can do if you have more than one wife. So I think a lot of people think that the Old Testament demanded monogamy, and it doesn't. So. Oh, one other little thing I went to mention. After we finished recording last week, and while I was all tied up trying to figure out how to let you know that the Facebook upload wasn't taking place as it normally did, I got sent an email telling me that I had a Bible question to answer. And I didn't see that Friday night, and then the next 2 or 3 days, I didn't have reason to check my email. I don't get a lot of communication by email. I'm not working anymore, so there's not any reason for me to check it on a regular basis, and I just didn't do it. And
you have a 24/7 job. You're working.
Yeah, well, I'm not working for an employer, let's put it that way. So I didn't get to see the email that said I had a question until sometime Monday. And when I got on their website to retrieve the question and answer it, they'd already withdrawn the question, sent it on to somebody else. So I got sent one and I didn't get around to it soon enough, and so I don't have one to read to you tonight anyway. So
You know, my former father-in-law was gifted a round disc. I'd say about 3 or 4 inches across, round, and it had some writing on it.
I bet you I can guess what 4 letters they were.
TUIT.
That's right. He had a round to it.
Yeah, he had a habit of saying, "I'll get around to it as soon as I get around to it."
Well,
and somebody gave him one.
It was an advertising thing. You know, if you've been waiting until you get around to it to do, whatever it was they were advertising, now you have it.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, let's go ahead and get into our Bible study. And to do that, let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the written word. We thank you that you have been involved with our race from the day you created us until now, and that you did not abandon us when we abandoned you by believing the enemy's lies in the garden. We ask now that as we open the written word, that we can have the gift of the Holy Spirit to lead our minds to focus on your wonderful character as revealed in the life of your Son Jesus, and that we might then find healing by being reformed in that image. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we are, as we've sort of hinted, reading out of the book of Exodus, and we have reached chapter 23. And chapter 22 had rules about protection of property and what to do if an animal was killed or if a person was injured or killed by an animal that gored, and so on and so forth. And the last verse I'm going to read here out of the New American Standard Bible read, "And you shall be holy men to me, therefore you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field, you shall throw it to the dogs." So, here we are at chapter 23, and this version titles this section a call.
Can we do something here? You gotta wonder why God would issue that kind of degree. Don't eat an animal that's been torn to pieces. Instead, give it to the dogs. Why would he say that? But then again, we were talking last week about um, chemicals being released into the body system if they're killed in a way that is traumatic.
Right.
And it's not healthy for it, it becomes toxic to the human to eat it like that.
Well, it's probably toxic to any carnivore or
Yeah, they'll feed
or
it to the dog.
any
Now,
predator.
here's here's a little information that is interesting, and you can look this up in the reference material at BibleDictionary.com. The biblical definition of dog is not necessarily a woof woof, bow wow. It also meant low life, the trailer trash, the peasants.
It was a derogatory term for people that you felt didn't weren't equal to you.
Well, let me tell you something that happened, and this is gonna give you the willies. It grossed me out when I heard it. My ex-father-in-law hit a possum on his way home, and the thing was out in front of their house. So he went and he dug a hole in the backyard, went and got the possum, and buried it in the possum, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had a housekeeper come once or twice a week. When she got there, she heard about the possum out back. They were so poor, she went and got the shovel, unearthed that possum, took it home, and cooked it for dinner.
Yeah.
That is the society we live in. This happened in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Well, it probably still happens.
Yeah. I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
I'm sure it does. It's really saddening. So, back to the Bible text, throw that meat to the dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Which dogs are they talking to? The four-legged dogs or the two-legged dogs?
Um.
Who gave the command? Did God give the command, or did somebody say that God gave the command? Because telling them to feed something toxic to people is not an act of love.
Yeah. Which might lead us to think that, in fact, if it was a rule that God gave, he meant the woof woof.
Yeah.
Animals that were already, to some extent, carnivores and predators. Or scavengers. The dog, to some extent, is more a scavenger than a predator. The cat would be more of a predator than a scavenger. But I was noting that any predator, because of evolution, prey animals, when targeted as prey, have a fright reaction, their blood is pumped full of adrenaline to give them the energy to flee. And in many cases, fleeing can save a prey animal from a predator. But if it doesn't, then that animal, as we've already noted, has blood pumped full of adrenaline. And that is going to affect the predator that eats that meat then. And as you say, that's what makes it toxic.
So I'm curious. I'm on Bible Gateway.
All right.
I want to see if I can see what they have to say about that. Do they identify it to be a wolf or a peasant?
Well, meanwhile, let's move into chapter 23 here. You must not pass along false rumors. You must not cooperate with evil people by lying on the witness stand. NIV, do not help a wicked man by being a malicious witness. They probably didn't have a witness stand per se in that day, so this is kind of being made relevant to our time, but they did take witnesses, and in fact there will be rules we'll read later where no one was to be deprived of life or liberty on the testimony of a single witness. There needed to be 2 or 3 witnesses. You must not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you are called to testify in a dispute, do not be swayed by the crowd to twist justice. And do not slant your testimony in favor of a person just because that person is poor.
Okay, I can't see this well enough to read it.
Well, I don't know what you want me to come look?
Where are you reading it?
Well, it was at the end of Exodus 22, the one you're talking about.
Okay. It looks like yeah, I just can't see it. They've got a couple paragraphs here about it.
Do you want me to come look real quick?
Yeah, come in here and take a look. Or pull it up there. Either way.
Well, I don't know what you did, so that would be hard for me to do.
Well, I could help you through it.
Frequently mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments, dogs.
Slow down. People are listening.
Dogs were used by the Hebrews as a watch of their houses, Isaiah 15:10, and for guarding their flocks, Job 30, verse 1. There were also, then as now, troops of semi-wild dogs that wandered about devouring dead bodies and the offal of the street. As the dog was an unclean animal, the terms dog, dog's head, dead dog were used as terms of reproach or of humiliation. And they give some references in the books of Samuel. Paul calls false apostles dogs, Philippians 3:2. Those who were shut out of the kingdom of heaven are also so designated, Revelation 22:15. Persecutors are also called dogs, Psalm 22:16. Haziel's words, thy servant, which is but a dog, 2 Kings 8:13, are spoken in mock humility. In other words, impossible that one so contemptible as he should attain to such power.
Okay, it does say that they do use the term dog in the Bible to sometimes
Yes.
wandering dead the four-legged animals that go around cleaning up the streets.
Well, yeah, and in the context here, when it's talking about an animal that has been torn apart by wild animals, it makes sense that it would be the four-legged animal that it's talking about there.
But it did mention a text in particular that caught my ears.
What was that?
Evangelists will use the text in Revelation to prove that that dogs won't be allowed in heaven.
And they're making it pretty clear that that's not what that means.
Low life,
Right.
the scum, the wicked.
Yeah. Now, did you hear the last verse that I read out of chapter 23?
No.
And do not slant your testimony in favor of a person just because that person is poor. In other words, when you are being a witness, when you're testifying, you need to stick to reality, to the truth, and not try to skew things to favor a poor person over a rich person, unless, of course, the rich person really was in the wrong. If you come upon your enemy's ox or donkey that is strayed away, take it back to its owner. If you see that the donkey of someone who hates you has collapsed under its load, do not walk by. Instead, stop and help. In other words, do the right thing without regard to persons or interpersonal issues and so forth. In a lawsuit, you must not deny justice to the poor. So verse 6 essentially goes in the opposite direction of verse 3. Verse 3 says don't favor a person because they're poor. But then verse 6 says don't go against a person just because they're poor. And I think it should be pretty clear to us that the goal in these regulations is that when making judgments about things that have happened, truth is the most important standard. And I won't go on about that because I have my own personal opinions about things that happen in our justice system and how sometimes truth gives way to other considerations. But anyway.
All right, well, let's talk about this Karen Reed trial that well, I'm not going to say what I'd like to say. It would take too long and it would be difficult for me to say it.
Yeah.
But things that go on that shouldn't go on in the original, I think it was at the grand jury hearing or pre-trial motions or something. One of those witnesses got up there and said that she heard Karen Reed say, "Did I hit him?" And by the time, and the jury did not hear that. And that was kept from the jury. And by the time it got to the trial 3 years later, what the witness said was, I heard her say, "I hit him. I hit him. I hit him," which is not what she had testified earlier.
Yeah.
They were given wrong information. Just don't feel comfortable with our judicial system anymore.
And that could be problematic because before long you'll have truly toxic people who truly do things that should be sanctioned, thumbing their noses at the court system because the general public seems to have lost trust in it.
Well, that officer that got fired over his testimony and over his behavior,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been listening to it, but I've been seeing they're putting up videos that other cases that he's been involved in are now being called into question.
Yeah.
Attorneys for the defendant in other cases are coming forth questioning his
The validity
testimony.
of his testimony, yeah.
And even my own son was traveling in an area that is known to be a speed trap. And he had with him, he was being very careful to stay within the speed limit. And somebody drove around him, and the cop pulled him over. So my son went to court, represented himself. And while he was there, he was talking to somebody who was waiting to also stand up and have his day in court. And this person told my son that if that particular officer was the one that wrote the ticket, then forget it. He's going to have to pay court fees plus the ticket. So my son went up there and was talking to the judge, and he told the judge that he was traveling with a feral cat in his car. Never been in a car before. He didn't know how she was going to react to traveling. Plus, he didn't tell him that. He had this feral cat in the car, and so he was being careful not to drive too fast. And the guy pulled the wrong person over. And the officer responded that he did get the right person, and that he checked his driver's license and his car registration, and everything was okay. And my son's ear picked up on that, and he said, he didn't check my registration. And the officer says, I did check the registration. I very clearly remember checking the registration. To which my son responds, if he had checked my registration, he would have ticketed me for that, because my registration had expired. I had paid it. I was waiting to get the proper registration, but it hadn't come in the mail yet. All I had on me was a receipt. And he was able to produce the receipt, and the judge said, case dismissed. To my son, you're free to go. And then he pointed to the officer and he says, I want to see you in my chambers now.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
But how many people got ticketed by that guy unfairly?
Who knows? Verse 8. Oh, no, verse 7. We were talking about verse 6, about not denying justice to the poor, and not in verse 3 where it says don't twist your testimony to favor the poor either. Verse 7, be sure never to charge anyone falsely with evil. Never sentence an innocent or blameless person to death, for I never declare a guilty person to be innocent. And I think the implication of that last phrase in verse 7 is, if you sentence an innocent or blameless person to death, you will become guilty yourself, and I'm going to know it, and I will never declare you innocent. Take no bribes, for a bribe makes you ignore.
See,
I was talking so they couldn't hear you.
where will your conscience be if you act to get somebody innocent sentenced to death for something that they didn't do? That means that's a definition of innocence there.
Right.
Where's your conscience going to be? Are you going to be able to live with that?
And as somebody has pointed out,
With that?
if you,
What happened to your conscience?
well, as someone has pointed out, if a person can live with that, if their conscience does not bother them, then they are already badly warped and twisted. Because otherwise their conscience would be bothering them.
Yeah, I'm not a therapist, but I'm thinking the word psychopath is popping up into my head.
Yeah. Take no bribes, for a bribe makes you ignore something that you clearly see. A bribe makes even a righteous person twist the truth. In other words, people who have economic resources should not be allowed to buy their way out of responsibility for their actions. Never take a bribe. How often do you think that happens here in our country? People taking bribes. You must not oppress foreigners. You know what it's like to be a foreigner, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now, I wonder if perhaps that was part of the reason why God wanted his people to have an experience of bondage in a foreign land. To teach them, to give them a background for understanding why they shouldn't oppress people simply because they're aliens or foreigners. I think some versions use, oh yes, the NIV specifically uses the term alien in that verse. Do not oppress an alien. You yourselves know how it feels to be aliens because you were aliens in Egypt.
You know what? I'm thinking you're going back to the bribery.
Yeah.
That's how we raise our children.
We bribed them.
Yeah. Clean your room and I'll give you a cookie.
Yeah.
It's just the way of life. It's what we're used to. What's in it for me?
Yeah. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure that anybody has ever developed a child rearing protocol that does not, to some extent, draw on a child's selfishness in order to convince a child to do what the child ought to do. Anyway. Now this next rule, verses 10 and 11, is going to be built on later, and it's going to be uh, an issue that will rise up in the history of Israel as we press on through the stories of the Old Testament. What it says is, plant and harvest your crops for 6 years, but let the land be renewed and lie uncultivated during the 7th year. Then let the poor among you harvest whatever grows on its own. Leave the rest for wild animals to eat. The same applies to your vineyards and olive groves. And of course, this then sets up a 7-year cycle that was supposed to be, not saying that it was, but was supposed to be a foundation of Hebrew agriculture and ultimately their entire culture. That you planted and harvested for 6 years, and you let the land lie fallow during the 7th year, and you let the poor harvest whatever grew the volunteer crops in that 7th year. So you were supposed to plan your agriculture so that you were setting aside at least the 7th of your crop each year, so that in that 7th year you would have food to eat, and you wouldn't have to till the ground, and you wouldn't have to collect what grew on its own that year. You could leave that for the poor. And that applied to fields, vineyards, olive groves, all of their agriculture. They did it for 6 years, but in the 7th year they let the land rest. And this then becomes the background for the modern practice of a sabbatical year. Sabbatical, or the Sabbath year, once every 7 years. And in the scholastic tradition, professors are allowed to take a year off, one in every 7, to recharge and maybe carry on projects that they want to do personally and not be tied down to the university for that time. So they have a sabbatical, and that comes from the Hebrew term for every 7th. So then, having said that, then in verse 12 it says, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the 7th day you must stop working. This gives your ox and your donkey a chance to rest. It also allows your slaves and the foreigners living among you to be refreshed. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago when we read the 10 Commandments, and particularly the 4th commandment. And we talked about it as the ultimate workers' rights legislation, because they had to be given 24 hours off out of every 7, once every week. It had to be the same day, and it had to be the same day for everybody, to give the workers family time. So everybody got the same time off every week.
But we can break that if we get our Sabbath vouchers.
Yeah. Pay close attention to all my instructions. You must not call on the name of any other gods. Do not even speak their names.
I was being sarcastic, if anybody's wondering.
Right.
Sorry, I shouldn't act like that.
Now that verse 13 is it shows us the care that God took to try to put a wall between his people and what he knew was going to be the major problem they would have during the next 1,000 years. and that is the problem of idolatry. So he tells them, not that they listen, but he tells them, you must not call on the name of any other gods, do not even speak their names. NIV says, do not let them be heard on your lips. Now, the next section says 3 annual festivals. Now, there are actually 6 feasts named, but they are linked together so that there's a specific feast day, and then there's usually a week-long feast that follows it, so that there were 3 times when the people of Israel were supposed to come to whatever place where God would choose to place his name and have vacation, holiday, but a time to worship God and to focus on that. Each year you must celebrate 3 festivals in my honor. First, celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days the bread you eat must be made without yeast, just as I commanded you. Celebrate this festival annually at the appointed time in early spring in the month of Abib, for that is the anniversary of your departure from Egypt. No one may appear before me without an offering. And there's a footnote there, footnote A, which says Hebrew appointed time in the month of Abib. This first month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar usually occurs within the months of March and April. Now, of course, the festival of unleavened bread is associated with the day of Passover. So there was a day of Passover followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we'll get more detail on how that happens in other books rather than just here in Exodus. Second, celebrate the festival of harvest, when you bring me the first crops of your harvest. So the festival of unleavened bread would be about the time for planting in early spring. The festival of harvest would come along in the fall, along with the time of the first fruits. Finally, celebrate the festival of the final harvest, and there's footnotes for both of those. At the end of the harvest season, when you have harvested all the crops from your fields, which would be probably around the beginning of winter. So B and C, let's see what it says down here. The Festival of Weeks. This was later called the Festival of Pentecost. See Acts 2 verse 1. It is celebrated today as Shavuot or Shabbuth, however those are supposed to be pronounced. And then finally, the C footnote there, the Festival of Ingathering. This was later called the Festival of Shelters or Festival of Tabernacles, and they reference Leviticus 23, 33, 36, so we will get to that. It is celebrated today as Sukkot or Sukkoth. So the Festival of Shelters, I've heard it called the Festival of Booths too. So those were the 3 times when the people were expected to come together and celebrate a festival and recall their allegiance to the Creator, to Yahweh. At these 3 times each year, verse 17, every man in Israel must appear before the sovereign, the Lord. You must not offer the blood of my sacrificial offerings together with any baked goods containing yeast. And do not leave the fat from the festival offerings until the next morning. As you harvest your crops, bring the very best of the first harvest to the house of the Lord your God. And then the rule that I've never heard anybody explain, but it appears more than once. You must not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Now,
Blind.
would that mean that if you cook veal, that you can't use milk from the calf's mother to cook it?
I've
And it,
heard that explained as showing total utter disrespect toward the animal's mother, but that's kind of, why would they care?
well, it's a rule that's listed here. In today's economy, in our modern world system, how on earth would you know, unless you're raising the animals yourself? If you're going to use milk to cook your meat, how are you going to know where the milk came from? They harvest.
Well, maybe you need to be a vet or a veterinary assistant or something, but um, what kind of shape is the mother in if you're cooking her unborn?
Well, it didn't say unborn; it said a young goat.
I thought you said veal.
Is veal unborn?
I don't know. I thought it was,
I thought veal was just calf meat.
but I thought it came from an unborn calf, an
Well,
aborted calf.
I don't know. I do recall that when we were visiting my aunt and uncle in Yuma, Arizona, we crossed the border into Mexico. I forget the exact name of the town now. And we got out of the car and walked around a little bit. And while we were walking around in one of the shops, my dad got my mother a purse. And part of the material in the purse was the leather of an unborn calf, if I recall correctly. Then we were going to drive out into the country, but then my dad got to thinking, now wait a minute, I'm not sure my insurance would cover me if we got into an accident in Mexico. So we turned around and went back to Arizona. That was a long time ago. That was when we were still driving that green 1960 Chevrolet Biscayne.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, right. Sure you do.
You and I used to go joyriding in it.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I'm fantasizing again.
Moving on here in chapter 23, verse 20. See, I am sending an angel before you to protect you on your journey and lead you safely to the place I have prepared for you. Pay close attention to him and obey his instructions. Do not rebel against him, for he is my representative, and he will not forgive your rebellion. But if you are careful to obey him, following all my instructions, then I will be an enemy to your enemies, and I will oppose those who oppose you. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, so you may live there. And I will destroy them completely. You must not worship the gods of these nations, or serve them in any way, or imitate their evil practices. Instead, you must utterly destroy them and smash their sacred pillars.
So tell me, is it true? And I can't remember where I heard this, but I heard that these sacred pillars were phallic symbols.
Well, yeah, they were. I was just looking to see if that's where it says something that I've read, but I think that's somewhere else. So I think at this point I'll just hold off commenting on that element of it. You must serve only the Lord your God. If you do, I will bless you with food and water, and I will protect you from illness. There will be no miscarriages or infertility in your land, and I will give you long, full lives. Now, here we're beginning to see the elements of God's covenant with his people. And there are people who will read this and who will try to tell you that God still operates like this. You do what God tells you to do, he'll bless you. So if you're poor, well, you're obviously a bad person because God hasn't blessed you. That means you aren't doing what he told you to do. And that causes a lot of prejudice in this world because they read these things. They think, well, God works like that. So if somebody's poor, if their life isn't going right, well, it's obviously their fault. They're not doing what God wants them to do. If they would just do what God wanted them to do, God would bless them, blah, 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 blah. And so there's a lot of prejudice and
So you were born with a birth defect. You must have done something to displease God.
Before you were even born. Yeah, right, sure.
Makes a whole lot of sense. You know what? I've really turned into a cynic.
Yeah.
I believe in God.
Well, yeah, but the point here is
The church is telling us the truth.
the point that I want to make here that I will probably make many times over as we go through this. God is doing this, I think, to demonstrate to the rest of the world and to the universe that this system, which sounds logical, isn't going to work. And in fact, it is entirely possible that when the enemy, the great liar, first stepped outside of what he should have been doing in heaven and began to lie to others about God's character and about his systems, he may have been telling people, if God would only do this, we wouldn't be stuck with this whole love nonsense, where everybody would do the right thing out of self-interest. And so God chooses a people and sets up a system and makes this the basis of his covenant with them. If you do right, I'll bless you. If you do wrong, I'll curse you. That is the foundation of their covenant. And what did they do?
And that foundation is selfish.
Well, yeah. And God knew that. God didn't do this because he thought this was the way that people ought to be led. He did this to make a demonstration for all those who had heard the deceiver's lies that what he was saying, what sounded logical, in the end ultimately would not fix the mess that humanity got into by believing those lies. Verse 27, I will send my terror ahead of you and create panic among all the people whose lands you invade. I will make all your enemies turn and run. I will send terror ahead of you. Footnote E there for terror. Interesting. Often rendered the hornet. The meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. So this is what I was looking for. In fact, I'll read that out of the NIV here in just a moment, and also out of the New American Standard Bible. I will send terror ahead of you to drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites, but I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals would multiply and threaten you. I will drive them out a little at a time until your population is increased enough to take possession of the land. And I will fix your boundaries from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the eastern wilderness to the Euphrates River. I will hand over to you the people now living in the land, and you will drive them out ahead of you. So that's footnotes F and G there. From the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of the Philistines, and then in the Hebrew from the wilderness to the river. So they're actually giving names to the Hebrew designations here based on what the scholars believe those things actually referred to. Now, let's read that. In the NIV, it says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send a hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way, and so on and so forth. Let's see what the New American Standard Bible does with those verses. And I will send hornets ahead of you so that they may drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. So, I'm not certain how uncertain the meaning of the Hebrew is there. Earlier interpreters and translators seem to be quite certain that hornets was what should have been given there. It may be that this version, in its interpretation and in its desire to justify what the Israelites were about to do, and to pretend that God approved of what the Israelites were about to do, want to make this word in verse 28 not the hornet, but just terror, which he'd already said, which would make it redundant. But the possibility here exists that what God intended to do was to make the land unpleasant to these people so that they would leave and he could give the land to his people. A lot of these people moved in there after the Hebrews got taken, went off to Egypt and ended up being held captive in Egypt. So they took advantage of it. It was a lush and fertile land, and they moved in and took it. And so God says, well, I'll just make it so that they don't find it so attractive, and then they'll leave, and then you can have the land, and I'll fix it for you. And we're going to suggest, as we move on through the history of Israel as given in these books, that what is about to happen after the people leave the mountain of God is a point at which the people decided they wanted to take the land their way and not God's way. And that's why what ended up happening as the Israelites took the land happened the way it did, because that's what the people wanted, and it wasn't what God wanted. Now, he then goes on to say, make no treaties with them or their gods. They must not live in your land, or they will cause you to sin against me. If you serve their gods, you will be caught in the trap of idolatry. Which, of course, we know idolatry was a problem from the time they entered the land until about 1,000 years later, when they went captive to Babylon, when finally this mix of worship of Yahweh with the worship of other deities went away, and that problem was banished from the people and from the land. And in fact,
it was a problem before they ever went to Egypt.
Well, obviously, yes, it was. We read the story of Jacob and his wives, and of hiding the household images in her saddle and telling her dad she couldn't get up because she was having her period, so her dad never found the idols that she had stolen. Yeah, it definitely was. But And I remember reading this article in an archaeological magazine many years ago, and it helped a lot of things to fit together in my mind. And that is that as they examine the layers of the materials left behind in modern Israel, as they dig down, there are layers where there are artifacts that are mixed, foreign deities and the Creator. That they would mix these things up, mix these symbols up, and make these artifacts, and then these artifacts would get left behind in the land. And those artifacts, those mixed artifacts, disappear around 600 BCE, about the time that the people went captive to Babylon. When they came back, they no longer did that. The demon of idolatry, as I sometimes put it, had been exorcised, and they no longer had that problem. How long have we been going?
I don't know.
We have less than a half hour left. I don't know if we'll get all of chapter 24 done, but let's go ahead and read it. Ah, yes.
Started, can you come in here and hand me something?
Right away or when
Yeah.
we're done? You didn't answer right away or when we're done?
I said, yeah.
Well, which is this or this, and you answer yes. I don't know which you're answering
I
yes
need
to.
to hear the when we're done.
I can't hear you when you talk while I'm talking.
Well, then don't talk when I'm talking. Just come hand me a Coke, please.
Right now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Be right back.
I want both.
I have time to restock the fridge. Remind me.
That's okay. That's okay.
Why? It's not okay for me. I
I'm
have
sorry.
to remember it. You're gonna have to help me.
Me?
Yeah.
Remember something? Oh, that's gonna be good.
All right. So,
I'll tell you what. I'm remembering this to tell you. I saw this ad a while ago that was just fascinating. If you will buy me their ring and put it on my finger, I'll be able to walk again.
yeah, right. Sounds like snake oil to me.
No, it's a snake ring.
Well, same diff. Exodus chapter 24. Israel accepts the Lord's covenant. So, they've heard the Ten Commandments. They've said to Moses, please don't let God speak to us anymore. We're afraid. You speak to us. We're not afraid of you. We'll listen to you, but don't let God speak to us. You speak. You speak for him to us. And as I said, we'll have cause to recall that later. So then,
Let me ask you something.
all right,
I believe it was Lee Vinton told the story where he goes to give. It is a fascinating Bible study or series, seminar, whatever. I recommend it. You can Google it. It's called All About Jesus Seminar, given by Lee Vinton. And he gets up there in front of people and he says, now I want you to imagine there's a door on the right of you and a door on the left of you. And I'm going to tell you that on your right behind the door is Jesus. And behind the door on the left is God the Father. Which door are you going to go into? Most people will say Jesus. Very few will say they want to go see the Father. And when he asks why, the answer is because they're afraid of the Father. So, why are they afraid of the Father? Have they not been given an incorrect picture of who the Father is?
And the point that we have made, especially as
They
we
don't
read,
know the Father.
especially as we read the book of John, Jesus is just like the Father. There's no difference between them.
And you got some cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah.
Because you're not afraid of Jesus. You love Jesus. You want to be with Jesus. You're afraid of the Father, but they're just the same.
Yeah.
So you scratch your head and you wonder, what gives? Oh, forget it. I'm not going to even worry about it. I'll just love Jesus and continue to ignore the Father. You don't know the Father.
Right.
You don't know Jesus. You only know what you have been told instead of getting in there and digging it out for yourself.
Yeah.
Go listen to Lee Benden, all about Jesus seminar. I believe there's a link on it, a link to it on the website.
I believe you're right.
invadingtheworshipme.com.
Yes. Exodus chapter 24. So we pointed out that the people have heard this. They've said what they said. Moses has gone up to the mountain and gotten these additional laws in chapters 21 through 23. And now it says, Then the Lord instructed Moses, Come up here to me and bring along Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders. All of you must worship from a distance. Only Moses is allowed to come near to the Lord, to Yahweh. The others must not come near, and none of the other people are allowed to climb up the mountain with him. Then Moses went down to the people and repeated all the instructions and regulations the Lord had given him, what we just read in these chapters. All the people answered with one voice, We will do everything the Lord has commanded. Then Moses carefully wrote down all the Lord's instructions. Early the next morning, Moses got up and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. He also set up 12 pillars, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent some of the young Israelite men to present burnt offerings and to sacrifice bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. Moses drained half the blood from these animals into basins. The other half he splattered against the altar. And this would be a practice that would be followed for a long time, of scattering some of the blood of a sacrificial animal against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. Again, they all responded. So this is 2 different days now. We will do everything the Lord has commanded. We will obey.
When in Ripple Port, do as the Ripple portions do.
Well,
Follow the crowd.
this is the people's confirmation now of this covenant that God made with his people. What gets called in the New Testament the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant that we pointed out was based on human promises. The people have heard the terms of the covenant with God, and they have said, we agree, we'll do it. Everything God has said, we'll do it, we will obey.
But they don't mean it. They're just doing it because everybody else is doing it.
Well, there may be an element of that to it, but ultimately they don't understand human brokenness. They don't understand sin as addiction. So they think, oh, wow, we know what the rules are now. Yeah, we can follow the rules. They don't understand their own weakness, that they can't do them because they are captive to their sin.
Because they want to be like everybody else. They do what everybody else does.
Well, that's part of it. But even if everybody else weren't doing it, they'd be subject to it because of their broken condition.
Brexit.
Whatever, yeah.
They knew it was bad, but they did it because everybody else was doing it.
Yeah, but the promise that they're making, the promise they're making here is they confirm this covenant. I think they mean it. They really believe that this is what they want to do. They really want to follow God. They really want to obey all these rules. They're making a promise. They don't realize that they can't keep the promise they're making. Then Moses took the blood from the basins and splattered it over the people, declaring, "Look, this blood confirms the covenant the Lord has made with you in giving these instructions." And this is the foundation then for Jesus at the Last Supper, talking about the grape juice, the wine, as the blood of his covenant. But it was the blood of the new covenant. This blood confirms the covenant the Lord has made with you in giving you these instructions. Then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu. Nadab and Abihu were the two sons of Aaron, two of the four sons of Aaron. And the 70 elders of Israel climbed up the mountain. There they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there seemed to be a surface of brilliant blue lapis lazuli, as clear as the sky itself. And though these nobles of Israel gazed upon God, he did not destroy them. In fact, they ate a covenant meal, eating and drinking in his presence. Now, we'll have more to say about this.
Even though they were afraid of him.
What?
Even though they were afraid of him.
Well, we'll have more to say about this later on as we read through this narrative. But just pay attention to what's going on here. And then there's another interpretation that takes place, and I want to look at this from here. They're saying lapis lazuli in verse 10. The NIV says, under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. And in the New American Standard Bible, and it says, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. So those two don't mention the blue, like this version does, leading to believe that the blue is not specific in the Hebrew. They may be assuming that since it talks about the sky. Here's what the King James Version says. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. A little harder to understand, but essentially saying the same thing. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain. Stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone on which I have inscribed the instructions and commands, so you can teach the people. So Moses and his assistant Joshua set out, and Moses climbed up the mountain of God. Now, some interpreters have suggested that what you read here in verse 12 is not in the Hebrew just tablets of stone, but rather tablets of the stone. Well, what stone might we be talking about other than the surface under the feet of the God of Israel? And so they suggest that what God gave to Moses and on which he wrote the instructions and commands was tablets taken out of this pavement or surface under God's feet, as described up there in verse 10. And then that is what Moses dashed to pieces later on in this story. Moses told the elders, "Stay here and wait for us until we come back. Aaron and Hur are here with you. If anyone has a dispute while I am gone, consult with them." So he's essentially put Aaron and Hur in charge in his absence. Then Moses climbed up the mountain, and the cloud covered it. And the glory of the Lord settled down on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from inside the cloud. To the Israelites at the foot of the mountain, the glory of the Lord appeared at the summit like a consuming fire. Then Moses disappeared into the cloud as he climbed higher up the mountain. He remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And that is a time period that will be repeated throughout the scriptures, including in the case of Jesus, when after his baptism he went into the wilderness and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And with that, we have reached the end of chapter 24. And it was a rather a short chapter. But there were some important things raised there that we will want to refer to in the future. One of them, the confirmation of the covenant by the promise of the people to obey the commands that God had given. And then, and we'll make it clearer later, this issue where Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders go at least part way up the mountain, and there they see God. God does not reach out to destroy them. They see God, and then they have a meal. They have a festival meal. They celebrate it by eating. And there'll be things there that we want to contrast later as we get farther on in the story. So even though we're a little bit short tonight, I think rather than starting another chapter, we'll stop here and plan to go on, starting with chapter 25 next week. Also, next week will be the 4th week, so following next week's Bible study, then we expect, and I never promise this, I just say we expect, that we will have a sermon presentation prepared and be able to present it. And given the kind of trouble that we've been having lately, we may go ahead and pre-record that sermon presentation as well, and then upload it to appear on Saturday morning. So, anything you wanted to say?
No, I mean, I always have something to say.
Well, given that, then, I would just say we hope that God's been able to use what's been presented here as a blessing to you, that somehow you have been able to draw closer to Him through what's been presented. We invite you to join us next week, and until then, we say goodbye and God bless.
Bye, everyone.